Good afternoon. My name is Erica Bond. I'm the Vice President of Justice Initiatives here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I am here representing John Jay's Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, while our fearless director, Rachel Marshall, is actually out on family leave right now. In addition to supporting the IIP, I work on justice programs across the college and spearhead the college president's Future of Public Safety initiative, which leverages John Jay's expertise to help communities reshape their public safety programs, their policies, and budgets to support healthy, safe, and just communities. And we will drop a link in the chat if you're interested in finding out more about our Future of Public Safety initiative, as well as a link to the IIP's website. I presume many of you in our audience are quite familiar with the great work that IIP does. But today it is really my privilege and my pleasure to introduce Kim Foxx, who is the moderator of a very important and timely panel on how we can overcome systemic barriers to justice for Black women survivors of crime. Kim is a longtime collaborator of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution and has really served as a model for how our partners and prosecutors can holistically address the public safety needs of their communities. I will share just a little bit about her impressive background that makes clear why she is the absolute perfect person to be leading today's conversation. Kimberly M. Foxx served as the first Black woman to lead the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the second largest prosecutor's office in the country. As Cook County State's Attorney, Kim has undertaken substantial criminal justice reforms focused on public safety and equity. She revamped the Cook County Conviction Integrity Unit and played a pivotal role in the crafting of the 2020 Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act. She also played a very important role in changing the landscape of cash bail in Illinois. That culminated in the passage of the Pretrial Fairness Act, which made Illinois the first state in the nation to abolish cash bail altogether. Kim served as an assistant state's attorney for 12 years and has also worked as an attorney advocating for children navigating the child welfare system. Prior to being elected state's attorney, Kim served as the chief of staff for the Cook County Board President, where she was the lead architect of the county's criminal justice reform agenda to address racial disparities in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. We are thrilled to have Kim here leading today's conversation. Thank you again, Kim, for your ongoing collaboration, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of our panelists who Kim will introduce. So with that, I will turn it on over to Kim.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Erica. It is absolutely my honor and privilege to moderate today's discussion. I have, as Erica said, been a long-time collaborator and beneficiary of the incredible work by the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution. In fact, just months after joining or becoming the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, I had the honor to serve with a number of colleagues from across the country in an executive session. So the Institute is incredibly important to me. And so in my time away from office, I could not wait to be able to come back and contribute and help as they continue this vitally important work advocating for justice, and particularly through the power of prosecutor offices. I'm incredibly excited about today's discussion featured for the Black History Month webinar for IIP. Historically, when we talk about Black History Month programming, it is around things like being the first Black woman to serve and honoring people who have been in service. But today's conversation is about the people for whom we are supposed to serve. It is about those who are impacted by the decisions of prosecutors' offices across the country, many of whom are overrepresented. I often talk about the fact that as a prosecutor, a Black woman prosecutor, when I was elected in 2016, I was less than 1% of elected prosecutors across the country. 99% of elected prosecutors did not look like me. And yet, when you hear from today's panelists and today's discussion, what you will find is that Black women, though underrepresented in positions of leadership as prosecutors, are overrepresented as survivors in our criminal legal system. And so as we talk about barriers to justice, particularly for Black women, it is important for us to have that context setting. And it is important for us as we honor Black History Month, particularly in these challenging times, to amplify the needs as they stand right now, to talk about how we got here, and most importantly, to talk about solutions to address the unique challenges that face prosecutors and communities across the country related to Black women in our communities. But before I get to our illustrious panel, for whom I am incredibly excited for you all to hear from, I thought it would be important to set the context for today's discussion with a brief video that highlights particularly what was happening in Chicago as it relates to Black women. We'll go to our video, and then immediately thereafter, I'll introduce our panelists and we'll begin our discussion. So if you will, bear with us.
Sierra Jameson, Naya Williams,
Tania Thomas,
Aaliyah Phillips, he was very violent. He was very mentally abusive.
I remember being in the bathroom with my the person who assaulted me.
I was 16 when all of that was going on.
And I remember just trying to get out of the restroom because I knew that I didn't want to be there with him.
He had hit me, he punched me during an argument.
The guy took out his gun and shot 3 times inside of the window, close range.
As I was pumping my gas and he saw that I put the pump back in, he walked back up. And he just said, give me your keys.
He shot, boom, boom, boom.
Then I'm looking at him, I said, are you trying to rob me right now?
And I end up getting shot twice in my face.
I said, sir, you're not getting my keys. And then he was coming at me with a knife.
So as I'm on my way to the hospital, trying to stay calm and conscious, I'm blowing out bullets from the impact. It just blew out my whole teeth.
So I backed up, I said, okay, and then I swung on him. And then he tried to jump in my Jeep.
I was an innocent person going to get something to eat, and I was preyed on.
Because I had been drugged, because I was under the influence of not only a drug, but alcohol as well. He saw an opportunity and he took it.
I saw a lot of teenagers my age going through that, fighting the person they were dating.
I just remember going to the police station the day of the arrest and, feeling extremely hopeful.
As women in my family share their stories, it was a pattern. They dated someone that abused them, or they were married to someone that abused them, and I ended up following into that when I got to high school.
And just being questioned multiple times by the representative from the state's attorney's office. She goes, well, nobody should touch you when you're under the influence. Nobody should touch you at all without your permission. But at this time, we're not going to file charges.
I don't know why a lot of people want to target young women. I guess because we women and they don't think that we're easy to target.
I'm extremely angry about the situation.
I thank God for being here, but it's hard to still survive something like this because most people don't survive, being shot in the face.
Most of the time, that's what I feel is just pure rage. Just thinking about it as a whole, rage keeps me up at night.
The experiences, though they've been traumatic, I now see them as strength. I now see them as lessons. I see them as a part of redemption for me.
It could have been my head, it could have been my neck, my ear, my eye. And I'm just thankful. And, I want to tell the attacker, he changed my life, but God spared mine.
I'm grateful. I went home to my son. I thank God every day that I'm here because it could have went a different way.
So joining us to engage in this conversation, we have Dorothy Tucker, who was the Emmy-winning investigative reporter from CBS 2 Chicago, who investigated the issues of Black women survivorship and victimization here in the city of Chicago, who will be joining with us today. We also have Channyn Parker, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Brave Space Alliance, and I'll let Channyn talk about the work that they do at Brave Space. We also have joining us today Ryan Mears, who is the Marion County Prosecutor, which is Indianapolis Indiana, to give the perspective of a prosecutor in Indianapolis dealing with these same issues. But I want to open our conversation with Dorothy to be able to share with our audience how it is that you came to explore this topic and how it is that you went about your investigation to be able to tell a story that is unfortunately not unique to Chicago, but having given voice to that. So, Dorothy.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share our report and to, most importantly, just engage with all of you. Before I answer that question, Kim, let me just give you an idea of where each of those women are, because I think in that short time, you probably connected with them. You know their stories. So first of all, Aaliyah, because of her experiences, Aaliyah now works in the space. Aaliyah talks to young children, women in particular, about how to protect themselves. So she has moved into that space because of what happened to her. Naya is still very frustrated. She has not gotten the justice that she is seeking. The people who did this to her have not been caught. I speak to her every now and then, and she's struggling. Tania couldn't take it anymore. Tania moved to Honolulu shortly after this. I spoke with her a few times, and a few months ago, I finally tracked her down, and she said Chicago was just too much. She didn't feel safe. She was very disappointed, as she mentioned, when the prosecutor said, no, we're not going to go any further with your case. So she just gave up on Chicago and left. And as you saw, Sierra didn't make it at all. Sierra's last words were, thank God I can go home to my 6-year-old. Sierra didn't go home 6 months later to her 6-year-old son. She was the victim of a second crime. The first crime was the attempted carjacking. The second crime, she was murdered by a former co-worker. He was arrested. He has been charged. This story was something that we came across the numbers, and it was the numbers that stood out to us, so much so that when the data journalist who is part of our unit, when he said, this doesn't make any sense, this is what I'm seeing. And we've seen the stories about Black women in crime, we've seen the story about missing Black women, but for us, this wasn't just 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. He analyzed 20 years. We literally went back and looked at every crime, the race, the gender, where it happened, and what happened, and just broke it all down. And when we did discover that this was consistent, that over the course of now more than 20 years, Black women have been the #1 targets of crime, which of course, as a Black woman, made me say, well, why isn't someone doing something about this? Why is this not, an epidemic that we're talking about? And the thing that I know and that is that I'm going to give you a few numbers here, but we all know that this is not just happening in Chicago. I kind of looked further at some other cities, and cities like Cleveland, they've come up. They have a task force that is dedicated to Black women because of the crimes that are there. San Francisco was considering something, Oakland, but it happens in New York. It literally happens across this country. But in Chicago, we just really said, now here are the numbers. We just can't say it looks like Black women are the #1. Here are the numbers. I'm just going to throw out a few facts for you. And then, we can talk about some other things a little bit later. In the city of Chicago, and our numbers are looking at 2022 for the most part. In the city of Chicago, Black women make up 16% of the population. They represent, though, 1 in every 3. They represent 30% of the victims. Black women, when it comes to assaults, 35% of the assaults are Black women, 38% are victims of battery, 34% of kidnapping, and half of the 50% of the human trafficking, 19 in Chicago in that year, Black women. Black women over-index also in nonviolent crimes. They are 25% of property thefts, 28% of motor vehicle thefts. When it comes to the CTA, Black women end up being 38% of the victims on the CTA. And the list goes on and on and on. And then the thing that got me the most was in that year, in 2022, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to talk to Aaliyah. For every white girl who was the victim of a battery, there were 14 Black girls. The ratio was 1 to 14. So this is something that is happening to Black women and Black girls. And it was startling to us. It was shocking to us. And, I hope and I continue to pray that people will listen and that will make a difference, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Dorothy. I appreciate, one, most importantly, the numbers are the numbers, and you're right. And we're going to share the resources with our audience and a link to a number of studies and articles across the country related to this. And what you will find is that Chicago is not necessarily an outlier. But what I also deeply appreciate, Dorothy, is that we're not talking about numbers, we're talking about people. And so your ability to tell their stories and allow for us to give face to what these numbers represent is critically important. I want to turn it over now to Channyn Lynne Parker. Channyn, if you could first tell us about the incredible work that you're doing at Brave Space Alliance, and then I want to talk about the unique subset of women Black women who are targeted and again overrepresented but underserved in terms of our criminal legal system. Channyn.
Sure. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the audience for being here. I'm Channyn Lynne Parker. In my role, I am the CEO of Brave Space Alliance. We are a Black-led, trans-led, TLBGQ plus organization that serves Black. Is there somebody in there? Yes. Hi. Checking out already? Are you extending your stay? So obviously I am in Springfield at the moment and I'm doing hold on.
You are fine. While you work on that, we're going to transition to Ryan for a moment, and you can go out camera and handle up on that. Ryan Mears is joining us. He's the prosecuting attorney out of Marion County, Indiana, which serves Indianapolis. Ryan has been elected to 2 terms as the prosecuting attorney there. Ryan, if you could talk about the demographics of your county and the work that your office does in terms of servicing as the prosecuting attorney, and how it relates to this subset of folks who are victimized in our system.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and we're grateful to participate in this discussion. If you look at Marion County and kind of what we see, unfortunately, it is very similar to what the numbers and statistics show in the city of Chicago. Indianapolis certainly doesn't have as many people as Chicago, but if you look at the raw percentages, they're very similar. If you look at kind of the breakdown, African American women make up about 15% of the people here in Marion County. And then when you talk about that 15%, they find themselves very much overrepresented in our criminal justice system, and in particular as it relates to domestic violence cases. Somewhere between 75 and 80% of our victims of domestic violence cases are women of color. And so, for us, when you see that sort of disparity, I think the initial question that you have to ask yourself is what can we do differently, or what can we do better to try to even out those numbers, or try to reduce those numbers in a meaningful way. And I know at some point in time we're going to talk about engagement, but part of that engagement is making sure that when we come to the table, we understand that these disparities exist because there's a lot of systems in place who have let women down. And in particular have let women of color down. And, we see that not only in, our healthcare system, we see it in our educational system, we see it just in terms of how the police respond to runs and how those runs are taken and what level of dignity and respect is afforded to women who are brave enough to come forward. And then also what happens when they enter the criminal justice system. And so, part of what we're trying to do is make sure people see us as an agent of change and as someone who can actually be helpful, because a lot of times when people have gone to the government or these systems for help, they found that it was not helpful. And the consequence on them and their family was actually the exact opposite of what they were seeking. And so I think there is a bit of reluctance to sometimes participate with the prosecutor's office. And the best way that we can hopefully repair and address those issues is making sure that we are proactive in reaching out, that we're always there to serve as an advocate. But we have to be willing to acknowledge that we, being people in government and the different systems, we haven't always lived up to our end of the bargain. And we have to make sure that we understand that if this is going to change and there's going to be meaningful change, we have to acknowledge where we have failed and also understand that there are things that we can do right now to hopefully produce a better outcome from some of the most vulnerable people in our community.
Yep. You're on mute.
Thank you, Channyn, calling me out. Thank you, Ryan, for that context setting. And we'll get back to you in a moment to dig in a little more. I was struck by the percentages as you related to domestic violence. What we know is that there's some universality to this. And the question becomes, how is it that we're seeing certain people show up in the systems and not? So just noodle on that for a moment as we get back to Channyn, who I think we're all clear on, to talk about the work of Brave Space Alliance and again this unique subset that you serve, who are also over-indexed as we look at these crime numbers.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank y'all so much for forgiving. I'm in Springfield actually advocating for this very vulnerable population. And I had to tell the hotel folks, like, yes, this room is paid for another day. But anyway, so yes, I'm Channyn Parker. I'm the CEO of Brave Space Alliance. Again, we are located on the south side of Chicago, which sees a high volume of trans-identified folks who experience a host of barriers, which include things from food insecurity on down to houselessness. But also we see a big overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. Also, I was the first openly Black trans woman, period, to work inside the Cook County Department of Corrections. So to what Kim just said, we see Black trans women experience compounded discrimination in the criminal justice system. And a lot of that is due to both race and gender identity, to name a few. We see a large amount of profiling, gender bias, which leads to an over-policing, and I would say just a general overall harsher treatment of this really vulnerable population. So I'll just stop right there because I know that we'll get into some richer discussions that I'll be happy to add to as we go.
Thank you, Channyn. And actually, I will stick with you for a moment. When we talk about barriers, systemic barriers that are there, you and I had an opportunity to talk a few years ago when I was the elected state's attorney in Cook County. You convened a gathering of folks, trans women and men, who have been impacted by the system and their concerns about, as Ryan talked about, coming forward. Can you talk about some of the barriers in a little more detail for one's willingness to engage with the system after harm has been caused to them?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the main barriers that we find, I would say with Black women, period. But when we think about trans women, we see a victim blaming, right? We see individuals who are oftentimes blamed for their own victimization, starting there, which makes folks very reluctant to report crimes against them. There's a lot of stereotypes that lead to disbelief, that lead to dismissal, and just a lack of legal recourse in general. So again, when we think about the justice system, we think about a system that has more times than not excluded trans-identified folks based off of implicit bias, but even the very direct bias as well. Um, we find that community-based organizations do play a critical role in reshaping a lot of those narratives and really ensuring that victims do receive justice. But again, even a lot of the organizations that do center that work find themselves severely underfunded, which also adds to another barrier of support when it comes to this very vulnerable population. So I could go on forever talking about what a lot of these barriers look like, but on the ground, we're talking about lack of employment opportunities. We're talking about lack of housing. We're talking about those essential needs that any of us, those of us on the panel, or those of you all who are viewing, would find themselves hard pressed to not figure out what survival would look like and how much would you do in order to stabilize yourself, even if it came down to you having to participate in street-based economies, right? That would actually put you more in contact with the justice system. So we oftentimes find this to be the case when it comes to trans folks. It's just a lack of overarching supports from being disbelieved all the way down to being able to access essential services and needs.
Thank you. And then we'll circle back to that. Dorothy, I want to come back to you for a moment to take this through a little further. You shared some of the follow-ups of the women who were identified in your story, but you talked to lots of folks. And Chicago, while not unique on this issue, the concentration of crime in Chicago, reported crime in Chicago, typically falls into neighborhoods that are predominantly Black and brown. Well, what are you hearing, or what were you hearing from the narratives of the women that you spoke with around their willingness to, one, not even just for those who picked up the phone and called the police and that barrier, but I'm sure you're aware that some people didn't even pick up the phone. If you could give some context to what those barriers were for even starting the reporting process for Black women in those neighborhoods.
And that was the most difficult part of it, Kim. I spent hours and hours and weeks on the phone trying to convince Black women that they could trust me. They could trust me to tell their story. Their attitude was one of not having police officers who dismissed them, having prosecutors who would not pursue their cases, feeling like it was a waste of time to even bother to try. And it was something that was so discouraging that they passed on to their daughters. I mean, a daughter may say something happened to me, and the mom would kind of go, what, we're going to have to go to a police station again and again and again, and nothing's going to happen. So that same kind of attitude that this is a waste was brought when I said, will you talk about this on television? It was like, why bother? What's going to change? And who's going to listen? Which is why I really commend those who did agree to speak to me. And, I was a little surprised, I guess, at just the stories that were so similar about how they would either call the police and the police wouldn't come, or they'd be so angry they'd walk into the police station and the police would sometimes look at the way that they were dressed, and the immediate attitude was like, well, I mean, look, or Tania, for example, she knows she was drugged, but they were like, well, you were at the party, you went into the bathroom. It was all, it was time and time again of that victim blaming that you talk about. It was very difficult to convince women to even sit down with me and talk to me for the story.
And so, Ryan, I want to pivot to you as a former prosecutor. I hear these stories, and I was in office when Dorothy aired this investigation, and we can talk in a moment. I participated in talking about my own experience as a survivor and as a prosecutor. But as a prosecutor, none of this is unfamiliar to you, as we have to look at evidence in cases and engage with our survivors. But can you talk about, what goes into, because there's a notion about what happens, and then there's the legal obligations that we have, and so that we can dispel some things that happen universally as part of our practice versus what we might see as trends. What goes into evaluating cases for charges where, for example, in cases of sexual assault or domestic violence, where we're relying on our witnesses? How do you go about evaluating these types of cases, regardless of the racial and gender dynamics?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to recognize that a single eyewitness is enough, and that can be enough to file charges. And I think that's a message that we always need to send to the community is actually, if you're willing to come forward and share your story, that in and of itself can be enough. But as you know, oftentimes these decisions are more complicated than that because there is more than one side to a story a lot of times. And so I think a lot of times what you're looking for is what are those points of corroboration that support the version of events that we are being presented with through the witness's statement or through what the police are submitting us through a probable cause affidavit. And so for us, as we go through that screening process, we're very much looking for how can we find points of corroboration, whether it's physical signs of injuries, are there medical records that support this? And a lot of times you're also looking at past history. Does this particular couple of relationship, was there prior instances of violence? Were there prior situations that maybe lend a little bit more support to what's being alleged in a particular case? And then I think the other part of it too is, when you're making that determination about whether or not to, take someone's liberty away, to say, hey, we're going to move forward with the criminal prosecution and all the consequences that are associated with that, is, you do want to have that conversation with the victim or the person involved to make sure that they understand what they're signing up for, and are they going to be, willing to participate in this process as we move forward. And certainly it's, the victims don't necessarily have a veto power. It's the state of Indiana, not in a given individual. But you also want to be respectful of the people that are involved in the process and make sure that they always feel like they have a voice and that they're able to be heard. But for us, it's that level of corroboration. A lot of times the 911 calls are helpful. Body cameras have been really helpful to us, medical records, things like that, which can put us in a position to hopefully get over that finish line to be in a position to file charges.
Thank you for that. I said I was going to struggle with being a moderator and not a panelist in this. So y'all just have to bear with me for a moment. I think as I, recall my time in office, and I think highlighted by the work that Dorothy did, there's this sense that the criminal legal system is blind, that justice is blind, right? That we do, it's the facts, the evidence, and the law. Do we have sufficient amount of evidence for us to be able to go forward? And I think part of the struggle has been, and as we will get to solutions in a bit, is that if we believe that we are treating these cases similarly, the outcomes would be dramatically different. And I think as we talk about, just as you mentioned earlier, Ryan, there's some universality, not just around people involvement in the criminal legal system as victims and survivors, but around other issues related to disparities to Black women. So whether that's the mortality rate or the childbirth mortality rate, where they're overrepresented in how they're treated in healthcare. Young girls, there have been a number of studies that have been done who show that young Black girls in particular are overrepresented in school discipline issues. There's a notion that my good friend Kim Crenshaw talks about around the adultification of Black girls, and that aids in the believability of them, like who gets to be a survivor, who gets to be a victim in terms of believability. And I say all of this in the context of having worked as a line assistant for a number of years and having had some high profile cases, for example, with R. Kelly, where that notion of were you actually harmed? What was your role? So, when I think about the R. Kelly case, for example, there was a lot of questions about, well, how did they end up there? Well, where were their parents? Where the shift moved to not necessarily doing, as you said, an immediate, like, we start with believing and then corroborate or disprove it. And we find that in particular as it relates to Black women, that there is something different in terms of how our pain is viewed, how our stories are viewed across sectors. And Channyn, I see you nodding. I would love to get your thoughts about that.
I have so many thoughts. Because as you know, right, like I grew up hearing those same tropes in regards to the whole R. Kelly thing. You know, well, their parents set them out for that. It was their fault. They were there. What were they doing? All of those things. But when we take that same lens, right, and I'm going to speak for trans women in this particular instance, there's this idea of, okay, well, this is the life you chose. And surely you know that this is to be expected, as if that gives some form of carte blanche, um, okay, to an individual who wants to cause harm. Secondly, there is the false belief, and I don't even think that a lot of people believe this, that when a trans woman is harmed, oh, she tricked him. Oh, it was her fault. She did something. No, no. That from what I have found to hardly ever be the case. We are a society that does not liberate men to be able to love who they love and like who they like and desire who they desire. So when there is the threat of exposure, whether directly or indirectly, that person's fear is heaped out on that individual's body more often than not in harm, and in this most extreme case, murder. So when we think about this victim blaming, it takes a lot of different shapes and forms, and it's rooted far deeper than we can ever imagine. When we think about the the movement against women's bodies, right? The objectification, the feeling that you are entitled to bodies, is where a lot of this comes from, regardless of the shape or form of the individual.
Thank you. And I just want to piggyback on that for a second before I switch over to Dorothy about these narratives about who are the folks who are impacted by this. You mentioned something earlier, and I want to touch on it now when we talk about the blaming and the economy. Like my experience has been, and certainly Channyn, I would love for you to talk further about this, that if we are talking about women who are engaged in sex work, that there is a particular vulnerability that they have because of their profession that would allow for them to be subject to behaviors and harms that might not be readily believed by those in law enforcement, or the vulnerability because they're engaging in an economy that is not legal that would then have them reluctant to engage. So if you could talk about that, because I know that that's part of the solutions that we'll get to, but I want to make sure that we make it plain. Like we
Absolutely.
talk about what we're talking about, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
We will.
come on. We've been, yes, economies are,
Yeah.
what,
We'll make it very plain, right?
make
So,
it plain.
I'll say a lot of times trans women are forced, if you will, into sex work. Okay. And oftentimes that's because, well, when you are barred from other opportunities of employment, what else can you do? Right. And again, trans women would not go into sex work if there was not a market. I want folks to understand that there is a market. As hard as that may to be believed for some folks, there is a market, and it is a very lucrative market. And well, when trans women find themselves the victims of harm being something maybe a bit more routine, all the way to something more extreme, there is a blaming. There is a, well, what did you expect to happen? And this is not just with trans women, right? Because we have to remember that non-trans women engage in sex work too. And when I mean sex work, we can talk about adult entertainment, period, right? We see these things happening at strip clubs. We see these things happening in many different adult entertainment sectors. But when we're talking about trans women specifically, we're typically talking about an exchange between two consenting adults for forms of sex. And that person oftentimes ends up raped, that person ends up physically assaulted, and in extreme cases, that person ends up murdered. So when it comes to the families who seek justice, those families are oftentimes dismissed. When it comes to the individual who is seeking justice, that person is dismissed. And when that person is seeking justice, oftentimes they wind up arrested, right? So those compounding things are really are realities for trans folks, which again keep them from seeking the justice that they should.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dorothy, I want to turn to you because you work in the media. And as we talk about narratives and the perceptions of who gets to be a victim, what does victimization look like? We have in Cook County thousands of cases every year, criminal cases that happen every year. And I would just be an observer of which stories got highlighted, which if a victim in Lincoln Park was sexually assaulted, that might get a level of attention, which is one of our more affluent white neighborhoods, than a young woman on the West Side. That is almost like a two-line column in the paper of a woman was raped and we didn't know her name, but we would get names. We would get how shocking and glaring all of this was. If you could, as a media professional, and I'm asking you to reflect on the role that the media has in some of these challenges that Channyn just described, in sharing what victimization and survivorship looks like. And you're still on mute.
You know, I think the media plays a significant role in what we see. You know, I mean, if you look at just the percentage of missing Black women and girls, let's just take that on a national level. 2 years ago, Black women and girls make up 14% of the national population, but represent like 36% of those who are missing. And when you look at though who's getting that coverage, name me one Black woman who's a household name that's missing, and you can't. But you can probably name 2 or 3 white women whose stories have been told again and again and again. They become household names. You know, so if we just look at nationally what's happening, that is the same sort of thing that happens locally. And so you ask, why does that happen? You know, I think you just have to look at who's making the decisions. It's kind of like the prosecutors and the police who decide, oh, I'm going to believe this person, I'm going to take this case, I'm going to fight for this case, I'm going to show up in court or not. You know, we, in our newsrooms, we don't have as many Black managers, people who are making the decisions to cover those stories as we should, you know? And so, you know, and as when I was president of NABJ, you know, we made a point of the National Association of Black Journalists, we made a point of meeting with as many Black managers at the top level as we could to point out these kind of examples and talk about the need to have more people of color, all colors, to be in the newsroom who, when a story comes up, they can stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, we need to make sure that not only do we cover the story of this Black girl on the West Side who was murdered, who was missing or whatever, that we do not just the facts, that we delve a little deeper into that story and we tell you that she was a sister, that she was a mother. We tell you a little bit more about her so that you relate to her, because I think that's what we do when that happens to the missing person in Lincoln Park, you know, and how does that happen again in the newsroom? Something will happen in Lincoln Park, and it would be like, oh my God, this community where we never see this sort of thing, it happens. But let me also put some blame on the police and prosecutors. And I've said this to police and prosecutors. They're the ones who send out the community alerts. We listen to the monitors and we know about these things. But back to the police, especially when it happens in Lincoln Park, they sent out a community alert to all of the media saying, oh my God, there's a young white woman who was attacked, who was robbed, who was blah, 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 blah. The Black communities don't get those kind of alerts sent to us. And I've said sometimes to the police, well, why didn't you let us know? Why didn't you tell us? I would have fought for the story. I'm in the newsroom. I would have fought for it. The prosecutors will say, we're going to go to court and we're going to do this and we've done this. And when it happens again, there's somebody that they're about to make sure that somebody goes to jail for a crime they've committed. We'll get those news releases. We can get that information. But again, when it's some Black woman on the South Side or the West Side of Chicago or something other, we hear about it well after the fact, only if you find out. But there's not that communications there. They're not telling us about their stories. So there is, I won't say blame, but definitely we all play a role in it. And if I can, and if you just allow me to show you what we as the media will do wrong at times as well, is I think that we will not do a fair enough job, again, in telling that story of that Black victim. We'll pick different pictures from social media. And Noah, that is the cue to show what I mean by this. This was a case in 2018. The girl's name, I think, Nia Wilson. Nia Wilson was attacked on a train, randomly attacked by a white man. Every station, did the story, but the Foxx station decided to find this picture on her Facebook page. That's a telephone that she has in her hand that looks like a gun. It's not a gun. But that's the picture that they chose to put out when they told the story, which almost made it seem like, well, I mean, she had it coming to her, or it's some, there's an implication there that not that she's at fault, but it's not a whole lot of sympathy for her when you see a picture like this. And how many pictures did she have on Facebook? Probably lots of them, but that's the one that they chose. They ultimately apologized for that. But, it is that sort of thing that, that we fight against, that we know happens. And I would also implore the prosecutors and the police that when you see the media do something like this, and the public, call them on it. Pick up the phone and complain about it. Say this is wrong. So I'll get off the soapbox.
No, we love you on your soapbox. And I failed to mention that Dorothy served as the president of the National Association of Black Journalists for many years. So a nationally renowned expert on these issues. I do want to, as we focus on, how do we address solutions? Ryan, you talked earlier about engagement, and what Dorothy is suggesting is, how do prosecutors engage with the media and prosecutors and police? What does engagement look like with the Marion County Prosecutor's Office before an incident occurs? How are you meeting the community where they are so that there is this level of trust and engagement where someone is willing to pick up the phone and make that call? How do you do that in your county?
Well, I think the biggest thing is making sure that we're all communicating with one another. And if the only time we talk is after something bad has happened, we're not going to have a very good relationship. And so the emphasis for us is making sure that we have consistent, constant communication. And it starts with a very simple question of what can we do to help? And we want people to know that we care and that we're here to help. And our help is not necessarily attached to the outcome of a criminal case. And so for us, we want to be consistently in the community. And just in our conversations, when we initially asked what could we do to help, it was, can you help me out with this child support situation? Can you help me get my driver's license back? I've got a lot of, I had an unpaid ticket. And just these small, simple gestures that we were able to do really help build up trust with people in the community. And then from there, it became, we need more programming in the summer. We don't really have a safe place for our kids to go during the summer. So we started a basketball camp, we started a soccer camp. And these were really driven by these community conversations that just started with what can we do to help? But in the context, and that kind of creates people maybe are aware of who you are, and they are a little bit more likely to call. They are a little bit more likely to cooperate. But then once you have that initial conversation, again, the conversation has to be, what can I do for you, as opposed to saying, this is what I need you to do. When we have those conversations with victims, it very much has to be, how can we help you? Because we know you just went through a terrible and traumatic situation. And so it starts on the front end in terms of being very proactive and engaged. And again, the simple things really go a long way. And being able to follow through on those things, that's the other thing. Like we can't talk about it. We have to be about it, and we have to be willing to actually do those things. So if we can come through on child support help, if we can come through on a driver's license, if we can come through on helping get their kids enrolled in an after-school program or participate in one of our camps, that really does help build up that level of trust. And then if we do have that interaction in the context of a criminal justice system, it still has to be continuing with that. How can we help you? Can we help you get you relocated? Can we help you find a place to live? What can we do to help make you feel more comfortable in your situation? And we found that that's when we have the best results is when we listen to victims in terms of them telling us what they need from us, as opposed to us trying to dictate to them, hey, this is how it's going to be and this is the way things work.
Thank you for that. As you describe it, what can we do for you? I think so many times as prosecutors, when I was coming up in the office, it was about securing convictions, right? And so we were less about the victim was the conduit to the conviction. As you mentioned earlier, we're representing the state. And I'll go back to Dorothy and Channyn on this. I think sometimes our victims felt that it wasn't so much about what is it that I need, is that you need me to be able to do this here. And which oftentimes led to attention, because, and you know this, Ryan, we would have cases where maybe we would want to go forward. And in some instances, our victims did not. We see this sometimes in our domestic violence cases. And while we might not appreciate the same tensions that are there where they come to that decision, how we move and engage with that victim, even in that decision-making process, I think is something that, I learned as a young assistant as I became the chief prosecutor, to frame it that way. How do we help you versus what is the outcome that I as a prosecutor would want to see?
And just to follow up on, I was just going to say,
Please.
like, we can't attach that help to the outcome of the criminal case. Like, if I'm here to help and I care about you, it can't be, oh, you have to testify. Oh, you have to do these things that are going to help me get the conviction. It has to be, I know you're in a really difficult situation. And if I'm genuine about my concern for you and your help, I can't preface that or condition that help on you doing the things that we need maybe in the criminal justice process. Because if you do that, then you undermine all that good work you do in the community and all the goodwill you've kind of generated, because people just say, well, he's just here to use me to get what he wants, which is that conviction. When the reality is, hopefully all of us in public service are just looking to make a difference and try to help someone.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That is the point that I wanted us to get to, is making sure that even if we can't offer service, so to the point that was made earlier in the video, there might be a case where we're not able to proceed, that factually the evidence may not be there, but a lot of times then people are just left out there. And proactively would be nice for prosecutors that even if we are not able to take your case into court, to be able to connect victims and survivors with resources outside of the court system. In Cook County, I was really blessed to work with a large victim witness unit who walks through the process with our survivors. But for those whose cases aren't going to go any further, the work is not done there. As you know, Dorothy, I'll ask you in a bit. What we find oftentimes with our survivors that might not be the only time that they're a victim of a crime. And so even if you can't help them then, and it's like, well, we can't help you then, when the next time happens, and more times than we can imagine, there is a next time. We lose a number of victims when we have treated them in that first instance. Facts, we can't prosecute this case. There's nothing we could do about that. But how we engage with you, even when we can't do that, is critically important.
Kim, I think all prosecutors need to do a better job of getting that information out. One of the things that I found in doing this story was all the resources that are available. You talk about, if you can't solve that case, that you can make sure the victims know that there are other places that can go. You can help them other places. Ryan, you said, you offer this, what you can help them. Well, I think one of the issues is that if you want to talk about building public trust, the public doesn't know that. There's got to be a better way to just make sure that you let women know. Because some of the women that I spoke to as well felt that they felt they were treated differently, that when they went to the police, they would talk to them and the police would kind of go, oh, okay, just go to the hospital, whatever. And then they would hear about other women who were told, well, this is available for you, this is available for you, and that sort of thing. And I think that, I don't know whether we need to have big billboards, on the side of the road and in all the neighborhoods. And I say that jokingly, but again, when I talk to women, I'm like, well, why didn't you call, and why didn't you know? We didn't know, and our mothers didn't know. So we've got to get that information. You guys have got to get that information out to the public, and that means using the media. That means calling those reporters that and telling them the success stories, telling them about the various programs that exist that they should be doing a story on. The mother who was able to come back and get her life together, and hey, so that that's what I would say to that.
Listen, I take the note, even though I'm not in office anymore. I think that was one of the frustrations, that tension point where as prosecutors in our offices, we're doing the work and there's an assumption that people know about the work that we are doing. We have a victim witness unit, and so certainly they're sharing that information. And it often became glaringly clear that there was that disconnect, that there truly was, unless you were intimately involved in the system, would you know? And I think one of the areas of opportunity as we look towards solutions is just that. How do we engage more broadly and utilize our partners in the media, in the community, to be able to avail ourselves to the people that we serve? Because again, I don't think you'll find a prosecutor anywhere who isn't saying, no, we want to help, but are missing the fact that, as brilliant our legal minds may be, without that level of engagement on the ground, we're missing swaths of people. Channyn, you have thoughts on that?
You told me to be plain spoken, so I'm going to do just that.
It is, sis.
When we talk about solutions, we are dealing with groups of individuals who generationally have been harmed for so long, they no longer recognize when they are harmed. There have been so many harms that have been perpetuated against certain individuals that they just now view it as a rite of passage. I know someone personally who was harmed, and this person's mother said, quote, "Girl, it wasn't nothing but some damn sex." So again, one of the solutions needs to be educating someone to know you have been harmed. Because since the founding of our country, Black women's bodies have been consumed, exploited, and discarded. They are desired when convenient, and they're discarded when harmed. And that is a hard pill that we need to be faced with in this moment, because that level of tradition, that level of harm has been passed down to us and now lives within our bones, to where we no longer can separate ourselves from what we deserve from what we have been receiving, you know? In terms of more tangible solutions-based things that we do as an organization, we collaborate with leaders to ensure that there's cultural competent legal processes for one. You know, we're working with attorneys oftentimes who don't even know where to start, who want to do something, right? Who really want to do something, but just don't know where to start. You know, we're working with individuals who are placed into a justice setting that's going to also perpetuate harm again. You know, so even the rehabilitation process in of itself becomes harmful. So there's a lack of prioritization of fair and equitable treatment, particularly when it comes to sentencing and housing and prosecutions of crimes that run so deep, especially when you're talking about trans people. You know, we can do the best we can to train law enforcement, which is really important, but we know that doing something on a systems level doesn't necessarily always translate to the individual level, right? Because we still see these harms being committed by judges, by attorneys, by police officers, correctional officers, and so on and so forth. But we really do need to create more opportunities for individuals to be trained and have space to address the unique challenges that trans women, but Black women face in the system and in our world broadly.
Thank you for that. As I said a little earlier, I had the privilege of sitting in community with trans women and men who were sharing the harsh realities that I was completely unaware of. And I was the top prosecutor. And so when we talk about solutions, I think part of it has to be a realization that there are segments of our community for whom we are tasked with serving, that if we don't have an understanding of that community and the biases that we carry into the work, we're missing it. And, you know, I remember specifically a Black trans man who was telling me that he went out to support a community. There was a raid related to, you know, allegations of sex work happening, and he had gone out there to be able to provide support and was immediately arrested, and described the horrifying events of when he arrived at the police station and the police not being able to reconcile that his driver's license didn't match up to what his physicality was. And that then these officers went and made him pull his pants down in front of others to make it make sense to them, and then became mocking. And it was such a searing story for me, because I had just, again, the top elected prosecutor who's here to serve all, could not fathom what that looked like. And again, you talk about that person having been treated like that by law enforcement would probably never, ever call the police again. And knowing that, then there's a vulnerability in that population, because people know that they are not going to call the police, and the underreporting then of crime continues. And so I appreciate your plainness around that. And I think as we talk about solutions for prosecutors who are doing this work, engaging with communities for whom you may not be familiar with. And again, why I say we cannot be colorblind. Justice is blind, but the impacts are not. There has to be some real intentionality about engaging in these conversations. And I will acknowledge for my colleagues or former colleagues out there, the difficulty of that, right? The language, the fear that you have. I don't want to say the wrong thing when we talk about misgendering or dead naming or these things that are the evolution of these conversations are relatively new. And so people are fearful of offense. But what I would say to prosecutors, whether you're at the top of the line or you're at the front line, you have to know the communities that you serve. And there's a level of vulnerability that requires you to go and sit with communities that you do not understand, and hear about the harms that you may have impacted, some willfully or some unwillingly, some that you just aren't aware of, in order to get to the training, to the indoctrination that's necessary. Because you're right, Channyn, like a lot of this is generational. Dorothy and I talked about this in her reporting. And I'm going to pivot back to you for a moment. You said something about that it's basically for many in our community, being harmed is part of the rite of passage. And it's a horrible thing to say. I had shared with Dorothy when she came to me as an investigative reporter to show me the numbers, to show me the data, to get my perspective as the sitting prosecutor on what I was seeing. And because it's Dorothy, Dorothy Tucker, I watched her reporting, I watched her stories, and I felt compelled to tell my own story. So as I say, I come to this work as an elected leader and as a survivor. And as I shared with Dorothy, I've been a victim from in the womb. My mother was a victim of a home invasion while she was pregnant with me. That there's not a woman in my family who has not been the victim of a crime, whether that's domestic violence, whether that is sexual assault, my own history with assault. And so I just want to pin on that again as we talk about solutions, Dorothy, for you, in hearing these stories and hearing almost this universal, and again, that's underreporting. We talked about a lot of the things I told you was never reported to police. So as we talk about kind of this being in the fabric of so many of our communities, what you learned and how we can more broadly tackle that Channyn just described.
I think there are a couple of things that we can do, and and again, I'm going to go back to the need for the public to really hold the media accountable, because the media is very influential. And I'm not just the news media, but look at the social media. Channyn touched on the fact that Black women historically have been very sexualized beings. But where does that come from? If you look at the music videos, and then you look at the kind of stories that we cover on the news, so it becomes easier than not for police and prosecutors to view Black women in a certain way, in that negative way. So, one, I want to see more outrage from the public. I want to arm them to call us and complain. Say, I don't like that. Say, where is that story on that missing Black woman? I want to know whatever happened to that story about that Black woman who was carjacked. Give me the follow-up, because you give me the follow-up about the others. Give me the follow-up. I want to empower the public, because they need to hold the media accountable. So I just want to give them more of that power, number one. And number two, I think it's important because, again, to Shannon's point, that, becomes this rite of passage. We got to break the cycle. I think police and prosecutors and men generally need to learn to respect Black women. I think at the core of this, it is a lack of respect. So how do you get that respect? You teach that respect at a very, very early age. In schools, we teach Black history, hopefully we'll still be teaching it, you know, which we're struggling with that one, but just as if we teach that, we also have to make a point of going back to the basics and teaching the importance of respecting Black girls. Black girls need to learn to respect themselves. It needs to be something that we have in the schools. It needs to be something we have in the churches. Black men, Black boys need to know to respect Black girls, Black women, and protect Black girls, Black women. So I think we kind of go back to that core. There's a chance, there's an opportunity to stop that. The crimes, generational trauma that we see in the Black community.
Thank you for that. I want to point out something that you mentioned earlier in my respite, my brief retirement that I'm in right now. I have the opportunity to look at television in ways that I hadn't before. And there are two documentaries out right now, one about Laci Peterson and one about Gabby Pietro. These two cases, as you mentioned earlier, these national cases that garnered all of this attention for white women. And we, I think, universally agree that anybody who's the victim of a crime or something horrible has happened to, we believe their story should be amplified. But I was very much struck by we heard those stories in real time. There's now documentary series that are being done about them. And so as you ask the question, name the story of the Black woman who had gone missing, name the story, I hadn't seen it. I did participate in a documentary a couple years ago about missing Black women in Chicago because it had gotten to over 50. And it wasn't about an individual. It was about, to your point earlier, Dorothy, that we had gotten to 50.
Yeah.
And someone said, we now have to finally talk about it. Yeah. And at the same time, we have these individualized stories, these narratives that are compelling about certain folks that in real time and then years later are made stories about. Ryan, I want to turn to you. There's a question in the chat, and certainly we want to remind those of you who are still on with us that we are transitioning into questions and answers. And there's a question in the chat that we can start with from April. But Ryan, I want to give you an opportunity before I ask that question. Again, what would you want your fellow prosecutors across the country, tops of offices to the front line, to do as we deal with this issue going forward?
Well, certainly, I think the community engagement is important, and it's important that we understand the people that we serve, because it's really difficult to help someone if you don't understand, if you're not educated about where they are coming from. But also, if you look at the numbers in terms of who wants to come to court and who wants to participate in the criminal justice process, we don't do a great job of always getting people to cooperate, in particular in the realm of domestic violence. And so I think one of the things we also need to think about is maybe taking a different approach. And a lot of times people don't necessarily want to participate because there's a mistrust of the system, or, and I'm oversimplifying here, there's a perception that you guys aren't going to do anything to help. And so, I think this is a time to evaluate, are there community-based alternatives where we can send people to try to get help to deal with these issues, where people can benefit from the same sanction a court would impose, whether it's the domestic violence counseling, helping people get relocated, offering, different counseling services for kids. Those types of community-based programs exist. Does it make sense to looking to explore those alternatives as opposed to just not having someone show up in court and then the case gets dismissed and no one benefits from any of these services that are available? And so I think one of the things we need to think about is, if we're not going to get people to participate at the rate that we would like in a traditional criminal prosecution, are there alternatives that we can use utilizing our relationships in the community, where we have trusted people in the community, where maybe people would be more willing to engage or more willing to participate, where we can offer those resources in a way that hopefully benefits victims, and again, builds that level of trust. So if things do escalate, they understand that the prosecutor's office, the police department, and hopefully the criminal justice system as a whole is going to be there to assist.
Thank you. And I see questions are coming in. I'm gonna circle to Channyn. because I know that you have a solution that you want to propose, particularly as it relates to the vulnerability of these populations who are engaged in an economy that in many communities is not legal. And want to give you an opportunity to say that because I don't want to miss that before we have to log off.
So this may feel a little controversial, but I suppose on a legislative level, the decriminalization of sex work. And when I say decriminalization, what I mean by that is we're talking about two consenting adults. We are not talking about trafficking, right? Trafficking is not sex work. Victims of trafficking cannot consent. Okay. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about two individuals who are consenting adults in a mutual exchange. The reason why there's advocacy for this in the moment is because what it does is it knocks the wind out of some of the bad actors' sails, right? So that's one way that we can kind of hopefully quell some of this violence against folks who are in those type of economies. But also, too, we can be more inclusive in our hiring practices, right? There are extremely competent, capable, educated trans folks who are perfectly suited for many of the roles that are out here. And they are barred from employment opportunities because of their identities. If we can commit to stopping those practices, we'll see a lot more safety amongst this population who is so often victimized. So I'll just leave it with those two right there for the moment, because I can go on forever, but I'll stop there.
I appreciate that. Thank you. We got 13 minutes, so
Oh,
we will give people
well,
we will
that's
give,
the case. No, I'm
no,
just
no, no,
playing.
no. We got 13 minutes to wrap it all up. If people are interested in getting some of your ideas and solutions, we're certainly going to be able to have folks be able to find you in the work that you do,
Absolutely.
brilliance that you offer. As I said, we put together a group to be able to inform me and my assistants and help us think about policy differently by engaging with Channyn, and I have been immensely grateful for that. Um, Dorothy, I want to give you a chance before I go to the questions too. I know you talked about prosecutors and police being more engaged in their outreach with the media. What's the other one big takeaway for prosecutors in particular who are on this call that you want, if they leave with nothing else based on the stories that you've heard, that can help them do their jobs in a way that better serves the community?
Um, I think that there is one thing, and I've mentioned a lot of different things, but, I think prosecutors, and perhaps because I have gotten to know you so well, I think there's a lot of good work that goes on. I think people, just in the time talking to Ryan, there's a commitment there. And I think that we could perhaps improve the relationship between the community and the police and the prosecutors in particular, if some of that information is known. I think that when there is a case that you've been victorious and you've made a difference in the lives of a Black woman in particular, I think it's important to tell that story. Because then the perception becomes that maybe I too should report because I saw a success here. I saw a Black woman saying thank you to the prosecutors. All of those women, Kim, who came forward during the R. Kelly trial, that was huge. That made Black women say that, Kim Foxx listened, and that made a difference. So, sometimes I think, if the if you're looking for somebody, if there's something that when you need women to come forward, you've got to send a message. You've got to figure out how to send a message to the community that we care and we want to hear from you. And sometimes it is taking advantage of something like what Kim did. That is a really good example.
Thank you for that, Dorothy. And for those of you who may not be aware of what she's talking about, when I saw the Surviving R. Kelly, the first installment series, having grown up in Chicago, like Channyn said, and like I'm sure Dorothy knows that there have been narratives and things happening. There was a prosecution many moons ago, but as a survivor, I was deeply touched by what I was seeing, and then I was watching with my four Black daughters that I felt compelled to come forward as a survivor and a prosecutor to talk about if someone was a victim of a crime, and to acknowledge openly that I know that there would be reluctance to do so because our systems may not be welcoming. And it was unprecedented to go as the top prosecutor and to talk about having been a survivor of sexual assault and abuse. And, from the media perspective, it was a mixed bag, right? It was, well, what does that have to do with doing this work? What is your survivor? And it does. If I may just my experience of having done that is it was taking off the blinder. It was saying that I know intimately well the struggles that Black women have with trusting and believing the system, and reflecting back to them that I see them, that I know them. A lot of this is about visibility. A lot of this is about, if you can see me, then you may give me a shot. And we did, I did that press conference. We established a hotline for Black women or victims or survivors of R. Kelly to call. And as a result, we got numerous phone calls. We were able to procure, as a result of that, one of the child pornography tapes that was used to ultimately convict him of child pornography. We were able to assist in prosecutions across the country. And personally, one of the more heartening things that I came away with in my time as state's attorney were the number of women who called me and thanked me for that, who thanked me for that. And even for those who didn't want to go forward in the work or in the prosecutions, for seeing them and acknowledging that role. And so I thank you for mentioning that. But it is, if I had a takeaway for my colleagues on this call, is that vulnerability that we want from our victims also requires our systems to have that vulnerability too.
Imagine this. Imagine that. I'm going to cut you off, but if we're talking to prosecutors and people in the law enforcement, we see the mothers and the sisters, and they all bring out the balloons, and they're saying again, my sister is still missing. My sister. Imagine if a police officer, imagine if a prosecutor stood with that family and made a call out and said, and just, for that amount of time, say, this is what we're doing. This is what we're pursuing. This is the information that we have, but we still need the help of the public. This was a young woman who is out there. We still, and just if you take advantage of that and just let the public know that, it's not just this mother who is knocking on doors, a sister that's knocking on doors. We too are trying, because they are doing the work. Just let people know that you support them, you're doing the work, and you're also making a call. Call us. Let me remind you guys again, this is the number that you call.
Yeah.
I think that would go a long way.
Do you all remember? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. No.
No, I agree. Go ahead.
Do you all remember? Maybe aging myself a little bit. Do y'all remember in the ending scene in A Time to Kill, when the character Matthew McConaughey played, the attorney, was describing a rather brutal crime that happened to a young girl. And he had the jury close their eyes, and he described this crime. And when he ended it, he said, "Imagine if the child were white." And the jury immediately snatched their eyes open and tears ran down their face in that moment. Art does imitate life. We shouldn't have to imagine a child to be white in order to receive justice. We should be able to imagine that was our child, ourselves, So as Dorothy said, the power of media, can be leveraged in ways that showcase our humanity, but also demand justice. And I hope that folks bring that with them in whatever respective corner of the law that they're in.
Thank you for that. Yeah. We've got 5 minutes left. We have a couple questions that I will quickly go through because I want, just a lightning round, last moments with all of our incredible panelists. Sarah wants to know, and Ryan, I'll post this to you, where the victim is telling us she is non-desirous of prosecution, understanding that recantation is often in furtherance of surviving. How much should we push to proceed regardless of her cooperation? Trying to weigh the interest in honoring the stated wishes of a victim and recognizing the reality of domestic violence cases.
I think that's the most difficult challenge we have as prosecutors, is trying to walk that fine line of being respectful of what the victim wants, but also understanding that there are certain people who pose a threat to public safety where you feel like the only option is to move forward with the criminal prosecution, regardless of whether or not that individual victim thinks that that's the best way to proceed. I think that is another thing that goes back to that level of trust, but also that level of communication in terms of you explaining why you think it's in the best interest of moving forward. And again, it comes back to those ideas of talking about what is it that the victim truly wants. I understand that you don't want to testify, but what do you want to see as the outcome of this case? Do you want this person to get help? Do you want this person to be enrolled in counseling? Do you, maybe sometimes you want that no contact order, all of these things. And if you can explain to them how those things can be achieved through a traditional criminal prosecution, a lot of people are more understanding as to why you are moving forward. But I mean, those are the toughest conversations to have with victims, but also you understand that your obligation is not to maybe just that individual person, it's to the community as a whole. And sometimes it does make sense to proceed without the victim, or, if you think you can make the case through alternative methods, sometimes you need to do that. But it's about having those conversations about what's in the best interest of everybody. And then also coming back to that conversation about, okay, what can we do to help you? If we decide to move forward, how can we help you? And that's when, I'm not saying everybody loves what we do, but I think that's when everybody can walk away with a better feeling of satisfaction when you're able to have those conversations.
Thank you for that. And we've got 2 minutes left. And so the lightning round apparently will be me wrapping it up. I want to acknowledge a question that was in here. How do you proactively engage to prevent violence before it happens without perpetuating stereotypes and basing that our outreach on harmful tropes? Which sounds like a great question to end and thank our panelists with. One, I think we have to have the recognition that the prevention of crime and violence in our communities is our number one priority. And in order for us to engage in meaningful crime prevention, we have to know the communities for whom we serve. And I think tropes are allowed to engage when there's a lack of understanding and we take just surface level and perpetuate onto communities that which we do not know. So you must know the communities in which you serve. You must know it. I want to thank our panelists today who do know the communities for which they serve. Truly, we've had a perspective from the media, which we've learned is an incredible force in how our narratives are told and how people perceive their value and their worth in the system, and also is really powerful in holding systems to account. Dorothy Tucker didn't just do this Emmy Award-winning investigative report. She followed up and held a forum at one of our largest churches in the city of Chicago and brought the top prosecutor at the time, the chief of police at the time, community members. So it went from a story that was being told to what is the call to action. And that is the power of media. And so I want to thank once again Dorothy Tucker for being here with us today, but also we have in the city of Chicago a task force that was established based on the work that this tremendous investigation had done. And that is the power that the media holds. I want to once again thank Channyn Parker, who again, for me as a leader, met me where I was with grace and humility and the fact that I did not know what I didn't know, and brought me along in a way that I believe made me a better prosecutor than I was when I started. Certainly much more to learn and grow and develop. But that's what happens when we have outside community-based organizations working in partnership with our stakeholders. For those of you who are afraid of outside groups who hold you to account, it only serves to make you better. And as you heard from Channyn, who's down in Springfield, Illinois, the capital of the state of Illinois, advocating for these issues, the best partner in advocacy for law change are folks like Channyn, who get in rooms and knock on doors. And so, Channyn, I want to thank you again for joining us. And last but not least, to one of my favorite prosecutors in the country, who appreciates that the success of our work is contingent upon the credibility that we have in our communities by asking the question, how can we help you? I want to thank Ryan for sharing the insights that he's had on the ground in Indianapolis and setting the conversation for prosecutors about who is it that we serve and how do we get that. And that requires a level of humility once again around asking the question of what do our folks for whom we are been entrusted to serve need, and has been truly an inspiration for me as I've done this work. Once again, I want to thank you all for joining us here at the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution, for celebrating Black History Month with us in a topic that is not celebratory, but in celebrating our history, it is to remind us of where we've been and how far we must go. The IIP has been unflinching in its willingness to have tough conversations, particularly in times like this. And so I am grateful to work with them in this continuing endeavor. I want to thank all of you who've joined us on your lunch hour today to engage in these conversations. I want you to go back to your respective offices and communities to ask yourself the question, how do we advocate unapologetically and unflinching for those who are most vulnerable in our systems so that we can truly have a justice system that serves all of the people. On behalf of the IIP, and particularly, I also want to lastly thank our team at the IIP, to Noah and Harry, who have been incredible in getting our panelists together and keeping the moderator largely in check. I want to thank them for their incredible work, and thank you all. And we look forward to seeing you at our webinar next month. Take care.